It's Adrian Gosbell here. This is going to be a lecture session which is on the deployment of responsive applications, so DSP-centric applications. We ran this session this morning. This has been slightly changed. Some of the slides have been slightly changed from the, so there's a difference between the earlier session. This is the third of three on this topic. Next month we won't have a lecture session at all, and the reason for that is a combination of other commitments that we've got here at Uniface. It's the timing of our annual kick-off and get-together, and it's also when a number of us also take vacation. After that, so what will be in the month of June, we will have a session which is on DSP development, and that DSP development will tie into the session with the idea being that we will ultimately deploy an application against the same environment or a similar environment that Dave is going to show. The session is being run by Dave Akerman from the UK office, and without further ado I'll hand over to him so he can pick it up.
Okay, just good. Can everyone see my presentation?
Good.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about deployment of the responsive web application that we built in the previous lectures. I'm going to start by talking you through the Uniface deployment architecture, just to put it all in context and give you some considerations to think about before you do a deployment. Then we're going to drill down into the detail of how you configure your servlet engines like Tomcat and so on, and your Uniface server configuration. I won't duplicate all of the information that you probably know from doing previous Uniface deployments on desktop or so on, but point out some important things for you here. And then I'll do a demonstration of actually putting the application out on a different deployment server. Starting then with the architecture, key point to note really is that a responsive web application typically consists of static and dynamic content. So your static content will be things like your JavaScript, your images, anything that can be cached by a browser. That will typically be served by a web server, but can just as easily be served by the Java servlet engine. So Tomcat, for example, can work as a web server as well. And the performance difference between the two is a lot less these days than it used to be. Obviously, dynamic page content needs to be generated by Uniface. So what happens is the servlet engine forwards any requests on a path, typically WRD, to the Uniface middleware, where the Uniface uRouter orchestrates connections to your server, says, do I have a free server I can use? I'll use that, or start a new server if needed. It generates the content. The results come back. I make this differentiation because this can actually be done in a number of ways when you actually deploy your application. So this diagram here shows you a typical scenario. You've got a client using a web browser to request a page, optionally a web server in the middle, talking maybe via the AJP protocol. It's a binary protocol from IIS or Apache, let's say, to Tomcat, which would be our Java servlet engine. You could use another one, such as, well, there's many of them, JBoss, WebSphere, etc. The key point here is the web request dispatcher, WRD, which is the Uniface web middleware interface, which will talk to the Uniface router. And here it's very similar to any other Uniface deployment. Effectively, you've got the Uniface engine, multi-platform, no need to rebuild all of your objects, all of the benefits that you know and we all come to love. So if you've got a desktop application, you'll probably create different folders for different configurations and start different shortcuts, accordingly, depending on whether, let's say, you're a development, test, or production environment. Also, in a web application, if you have multiple, the way you'll do this is via the URL. So here I break down a URL. You request the server. If you don't specify a port, the default is 80. And in the first line example here, I've got a context, which is the Tomcat name for a virtual directory. And here we've got a production one for our application, for example. And then we specify the servlet. Web request dispatcher is the default we provide. And that means I want some dynamic content, so we're going to load the main DSP page in. I could instead say JS main.js, which would be a JavaScript file, a static file. In the second example below, we've actually got a different virtual directory for an application, or maybe a build of an application. And then via the servlet mapping, I've actually changed the default WRD to test. We might have dev, test, production. They might point to different Uniface configurations which use, let's say, a different database or so on. So that's all done in the web servlet config, as I'll show you. So here's a diagram trying to show you the end-to-end process. You request a URL on a browser. It goes through to either IIS, which might serve it if it's static, a web server, or just straight to Tomcat, which might serve it again if it's static. And if you request something with the WRD context, or whatever you rename it to, it will actually look at its configuration. This actually maps to a folder in Tomcat, which has a hidden configuration folder, webinf, webxml. You can't request that from a browser. And that will specify the Uniface configuration in the middleware parameter, as you'll see a bit more detail later. So we are talking to the server on the standard Uniface router port here, 1301. That might differ if you've got multiple installations. You give it the details of how to connect to the server, and you'll specify what we call a UST, Uniface Server Type, which is basically a named configuration. So the default one is called WASV, Web Application Server. It might, for example, be called WebStart for my WebStart application. Pretty straightforward. So the request goes through to Tomcat. If it's static, it should just serve it and return back. If it's dynamic, it will connect to Uniface, talk to a uRouter, get the response after generating the page, and just return it back up the chain. The way you define those contexts or virtual directories in Tomcat is literally you create a file in Tomcat's conf Catalina localhost folder, and it just points to the actual physical location. Just have to remember that Tomcat, being sort of Java based, is case sensitive. Considerations then before you do a deployment. It obviously goes without saying that you need to plan. Think about what resources you need, think about, do you need to harden it if it's going to be on the internet, public facing, etc. Even if it's internal, in fact, you probably want to harden it. So remove those manager applications and things that make life easier for you so that people can't try and hack into them. Obviously, before you start, you'll want to look at the product availability matrix and see that the platform you want, be it Windows or Linux or whatever it is with your database, is supported. Make sure you have the local administrator privileges to do an installation. If you outsource your management of your IS, you might need to request that in advance. Get a license. I'll talk about licenses in a moment in a bit more detail. And if you're going via a secure connection, SSL effectively, you may want to have a certificate. If it's internal, you can actually just generate your own, but if it's an external one, you'll probably need to get that signed by a certificate authority, and you'll need to buy one. These are just things that you'll want to cover, and we'll probably go into more detail on these on later security lectures that are forthcoming. So obviously get your installation media. Everything goes without saying needs to match. If you've got a 32-bit or 64-bit Uniface, you'll probably want to use the 32-bit drivers or 64 to match for your database, and the same with the client libraries, be it for Oracle or SQL Server or whatever. It is actually possible to mix and match the Tomcat because they're talking via TCP/IP. I could have a 32-bit Uniface running with 32-bit database drivers on a 64-bit Windows, let's say, but use a 64-bit Tomcat because we're just talking to it via TCP/IP. There may be other dependencies, so we provide everything with a Uniface deployment that you need, such as a Java and a Tomcat installation. But if you want to use the latest ones, for security, maybe some patches you need, you can install them and configure them quite easily. I'll talk again a little bit about that later. But think about other things you need for your application deployment, and obviously make sure you've got those to hand. And then obviously have an application build. I'm going to kind of take a development build and just modify it on the fly, but you may have some standard build process instead, which actually creates a custom build for you. Licenses, then obviously you need a license to run the Uniface web application server functionality. It's typically licensed per core and not concurrent as per a desktop application. You'll need the server USP and service features and anything like your database and so on. It's pretty straightforward to do. I recommend you install the DLM, the license manager application, and there's a feature in there where you can actually identify the host ID, and it can actually write a file that you can send to license management to request a license, and then you just literally add the file in there and away you go. If you've got problems, you can always download an emergency license which lasts for a couple of weeks from download.uniface.com, and once you've got a license, you can just specify it in the DLM, but a lot of people choose to specify it in a license file to sort of simplify deployment. In the example here, I've just got a local license file, which for a responsive application is probably all you need. I'm also including an extra license server, a backup server if you like, and this is actually serving a concurrent licenses out of a license service, which would more typically be done in a desktop application. You wouldn't really need that for a web application. The other parameters here, we've just turned off the warnings when it's about to expire from default of something like 14 days to not show you anything, but we actually with the LM transcript write things to the log file at that point just to say your license is about to expire. As I say, security will be covered more in a future lecture, but just a reminder that there is actually plenty of information in the help on doing some of the security customization, the web application server pages and customized WRD messages. I'll show you some of that if we have time at the end, and you can do various hardening of your Tomcat, for example, again, which will probably be covered in a future lecture, and we'll probably talk a little bit about ports and firewalls and so on, so I won't go into that in detail now for this presentation, although we do courses and consultancy as well on this if you need it. Okay, so other considerations, performance. Just good to think about this before you start deployment. Some web browsers are faster than others, maybe at doing JavaScript, maybe at just connecting to the servers and so on. So just think about which ones you support and just test these things with all the expected browsers before you actually put it out there. You'll want to reduce the file transfer and optimize the performance, so minifying is a good idea. What I mean by that is just typically removing all the white space and comments from your static files. You might set up in your web server things like file compression for certain file types, and most web browsers can actually uncompress that on the fly without any additional installation requirements, so it's worth doing that. Thinking about setting cache headers, if you're going for a web server, you can often set that and say that for static files, I want this to last this long, just to make sure that you're not actually reloading them every time you request something from a web browser. Typically things are cached, anything static, but obviously you can't do that for dynamic content. Put your servers quite close together. Typically we install Tomcat and Uniface runtime on the same server and load balance that, and possibly web servers as well if needed, but load balancing is probably only needed if you're sort of dealing with thousands of concurrent clients. Obviously you need to test it for your platform, but that's something I'll touch on briefly in a moment as well. Obviously tune your application, turn off any logging, check your code performance. You can do various tricks to improve performance in your application, like let's say you've got a drop-down list of fairly static data. Some people integrate an app cache. I think there's an example on Uniface Info created by Eddie Knox, which talks about using Couchbase. And the idea is you create your drop-down list, you save that in an external app cache using the Uniface interface functionality, and it will remember it for a certain amount of time and then forget it. So you can actually go and check before you actually regenerate all this from the database, have I got that? Go and get it, and just improve the performance a little bit along the way. Another interesting tip from Uniface tuning is that if you're using resources, i.e. standardized deployment, which remember is the only option in Uniface 10, it does make life a lot easier for you, so I strongly recommend it. You don't have to worry about all the file redirections you do in the old style deployment. But what it does is it indexes all of the contents of an archive file or a folder, whichever you choose to deploy with, but it doesn't, by default, Uniface doesn't keep all of that form in memory. Now, if you have a lot of memory on your server and it's not going to cause page swapping and you want to improve performance, you can tell Uniface in the settings in your assignment file to do $memory zip is all, and it will load all of the components into memory and therefore save all of that data I/O and just generally improve performance when you're requesting Uniface forms. As I say, you just need to make sure that you've got enough resources on your server for that to be effective, because if you don't have enough memory, for example, and your server starts swapping to disk, then of course it could make things worse. There's other tuning you can do, of course, database connector tuning, these kind of things, parameters, and of course your web server and servlet engine, depending upon your expected load. Again, as this is outside Uniface but fairly standard, I won't go into the detail on these now. A quick aside then, I talked about load balancing. Basically, you can have a web server in the middle serving static content. You will typically say, serve my static content from there, rather than loading Tomcat. So we're splitting the load a little bit here. And you can then use hardware or software load balancing to even split all the requests to different web servers and requests to different application servers, so they can both be load balanced at that tier. Again, this is using fairly standard technology, and so there's plenty of information out there on doing it. But the quick summary is that they typically use the AJP binary protocol to reduce the overhead of that extra hop. And obviously we're adding a slight overhead if you've got a low load, but the idea is that by having multiple servers, if the load increases, we're actually splitting the load, therefore improving the performance. And some things like the Tomcat redirector, which we can automatically install for you as part of the Uniface deployment, there is functionality in there that actually can do software-based load balancing without you using external hardware load balancer. So there are plenty of choices there.